Good evening, everyone, and welcome to CRM Talks, the Connecticut River Museum's lecture series. My name is Allison Insel, and I'm the manager of public programs at the museum. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome a good friend to the museum, Gary Mower, as our featured speaker. If you haven't already, I highly recommend you visit the museum and come and see the new exhibit on the third floor, Speed, Hydroplane Racing on the Connecticut River, that is on exhibit through October. Some of the engines that Gary will be speaking about this evening are actually on display there. Gary Mower is a retired mechanical engineer with experience in aerospace, automotive, and consumer products, a graduate of Northeastern University with a degree in mechanical engineering. He has a lifelong interest in antique, marine, automotive, and mechanical hobbies. A prolific collector, Mower owns 60 antique outboard motors dating from 1911 through 1940. He has rebuilt and run antique outboard motors at various Northeast meets and was recognized as an antique outboard motor collector in the July 2021 issue of Soundings magazine. Gary has also been an active member of Antique Outboard Motor Club since 1975 and works as advisor to the Mystic Seaport for their annual Antique Marine Engine Exposition for the last 30 years. So without further ado, it's my great privilege to welcome Gary this evening as our featured speaker. Okay, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Hi, everyone, and welcome. As Ellen said, I'm Gary Mower, and I'm here to make a presentation on the history of outboard motors and outboard racing from 1900 to 1940. I'd like to thank Amy Trout, the museum curator, and all the other folks at the Connecticut River Museum for making this giving me this opportunity to speak tonight. Amy contacted me last fall regarding information needed for a new museum display she was putting together regarding outboard motor racing on the Connecticut River, those who raced and the motors they raced with. Amy found me online through the Antique Outboard Motor Club, and we have been working together since to put together the display now being shown on the third floor of the museum. While working on the content for the display of racing motors and other artifacts, the question came up, how were outboard motors developed to get them to this point? Thus, the idea for a short history of the invention and development of the outboard motor. Okay, we'll try and cover tonight some chapters including marine propulsion before outboard motors, invention and early outboard motor production, the creation and growth of a new industry, including companies like Waterman, Evinrude, Kale, Lockwood Ash, and Mercury. We'll finish off with some outboard motor racing pictures and facts, talk about the Antique Outboard Motor Club, and that will conclude. The development of the outboard motor as we know it today started in the late 1800s as the Industrial Revolution was beginning and internal combustion engines were first being developed. Marine propulsion at this time was either man-powered with oars or paddles, wind-powered with sails, or powered by steam engines. A way to propel small boats inexpensively and reliably had yet to be developed. Boating at the time was either for commercial purposes like fishing, or was the wealthy man's sport with larger sail or power boats that were out of reach for most people. Small rowboats or canoes filled the demand for hunters and fishermen and those wishing to experience the outdoors. Before there were outboard motors, inboard two-cycle marine engines became available in the late 1800s for boats of all sizes. They were more affordable and were available to more people, but they had their limitations. The motors were mounted permanently inside the boat, taking up valuable space, were noisy, and safety was a concern with spinning flywheels and other mechanical apparatus whirring around on the engine. While used for commercial purposes, many were used for pleasure boats. Boats were not very portable and had to be stored at a boatyard or at your dock if you were lucky enough to have waterfront property. These engines were plentiful, as there were many small foundries and machine shops that could easily produce them. 150 plus manufacturers produced these motors, and some of these companies eventually changed over to outboard motor production as time went on. The first outboard inventions. The first outboard motor started development circa 1895. Inventors were looking for lighter weight portable motors that could be easily attached to any smaller rowboat or dinghy. In 1881, Frenchman Gustave Chauvet introduced his motor and screw electric boat motor at an exposition in Paris, but was never produced. In 1882, additional attempts at designing an electrically powered boat motor were made by W. W. Griscom of Philadelphia, F. A. LaRoche, also of Philadelphia. In 1885, Samuel Jones of Newark, New Jersey, and F. G. Curtis of New York City also designed an electric outboard motor, but none of these were ever commercially produced. Wilbur Salisbury of Chicago entered the fledgling outboard world in 1892 with plans and a patent for an electric motor marketed under his name. Then Frank S. Allen of New York marketed the Salisbury under his own name, apparently after purchasing the rights from Salisbury in 1895. The 1895 Salisbury Allen portable electric propeller was America's first generally advertised and mass-produced electric outboard motor. In 1896, Albert Otto, president of the American Motor Company, Long Island City, New York, designed an outboard motor based on American stationary and inboard motor design. He was an engineer, but not a promoter, as the company reportedly made only 25 detachable rowboat motors. None are known today. However, this is the first internal combustion outboard motor for which there is documentation in this country. As a side note, extremely talented engineer, machinist, and Antique Outboard Motor Club member Dave Bono of Westerly, Rhode Island, recreated from scratch a replica of the American outboard motor, strictly from 4 pictures of the motor from books of that time. Here are a few pictures of this wonderful creation. Okay, 1900 Submerged Electric Motor Company. The Submerged Electric Motor Company came out with its electric propeller in 1900. Organized by Wisconsin Senator James Stout, the company advertised its device as auxiliary power for sailboats and houseboats, and also pointed out that the machinery, all being in the propeller and rudder, saves room inside the boat. The 1901 Pan American Exposition was held in Buffalo, New York, and the new Submerged Electric Motor Company exhibited the motor. This resulted in many inquiries and orders coming in from all over the world. The motor itself was submerged in a sealed housing, weighed 30 pounds, mounted on the transom off the back of the boat. The company also advertised a small gasoline engine around 1905, but this was never produced. Let's look at early production gasoline outboard motor manufacturers. Here's the dates of, as they came online. 1906 Waterman Motor Company. This is the first commercially produced gasoline outboard motor. 1903, Cameron Waterman of Grosse Isle, Michigan, was a law student at Yale University. That was the year that motorcycles first came out, and he was among the first to procure one. At the end of the riding season, he removed the engine and hung it over the back of a desk chair to clean and overhaul it. While working on it, the idea occurred to him that such a motor might possibly be used on his rowboat when he went on fishing trips. Every summer, he spent a part of his vacation at Spruce Harbor on Lake Superior and had a very strenuous 5-mile road to his favorite fishing grounds. It seemed to him that if this motor could run a bicycle, a similar motor could be rigged up with a propeller and rudder to run a rowboat. After graduation, Cameron worked for Whitmore, Hulbert & Whitmore, a Detroit law firm that specialized in patent and trademark law. While there, he created a series of sketches and drawings describing the features of this motor. He then took the motorings to George Thrall, manager of the Taylor Water Tube Boiler Company in Detroit. Taylor agreed to get involved in the project if Waterman would supply the motorcycle engine. Waterman purchased a Curtis 3-horsepower air-cooled engine, and Thrall built the prototype using part of a bicycle frame and utilizing a chain to connect the engine to a sprocket at the propeller to drive the boat. As a side note, Glenn Curtis of Hammondsport, New York, specialized in air-cooled engines, and this is the one that Waterman purchased. His specialty was motorcycles, and he would later become a pioneer in the design and experimentation of aircraft and flying boats. In February 1905, Waterman and a party of friends took the prototype to Grosse Island and attached it to a 15-foot steel rowboat for a trial run. Although the Detroit River was full of ice cakes, the tryout was a complete success, except for the fact that once a piece of ice got caught between the chain and sprocket, causing the chain to run off the sprocket. That day, someone in the party called it an outboard motor. In early 1906, the Water Marine Company was formed, with Cameron Waterman as president and George Thrall as vice president. A patent was applied for on December 1905 for a boat propelling device using what was basically the prototype they had assembled at the boiler factory. The patent was approved in April of 1907 and assigned to the Waterman Marine Motor Company. Waterman then consulted with production engineer Oliver Bartell, who suggested changing the chain drive to a vertical shaft with bevel gears to avoid the problem caused by ice and other debris. Once the redesign was completed, Waterman then worked with the Kale Brothers Company to build the first air-cooled production models of the outboard motor. Kale made arcade and slot machines and had developed a line of stationary and inboard engines of their own design. They made the first 25 machines for Waterman. Soon it was discovered more improvements were necessary, and Bartell changed the design to be water-cooled with a water pump driven by a cam on the drive shaft. In late 1906, Waterman capitalized his new company with $30,000 to manufacture and market the new Waterman Porto for portable outboard motor, a 2-horsepower device weighing 35 pounds and selling for $50. A new factory was built in Detroit in 1907 with the capacity to assemble 12 to 15 motors a day. With 15 employees, the company built between 800 and 1,000 motors in its first full year and 3,000 in its second. As a side note, regardless of his prowess as a patent attorney, Waterman could not keep others from further developing his outboard motor idea. His primary competitor was a man named Ole Evinrude, who established a motor manufacturing firm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1909. More on Evinrude later. Waterman noted he never had a basic patent because he couldn't get one, and neither could anyone else. That was because back in 1883, a fellow stuck a small steam boiler on the back of a boat, used a propeller, and was given a US patent on what he called an outboard motor. It never worked and never was produced, but the issuance of the patent prevented anyone else from getting full protection. Despite the rapid growth in orders for outboards, Waterman did not restrict the new company's work to them alone. Beginning in 1908, the firm produced a range of inboard motors to complement this product line. Improvements continued as in 1910, a muffler was added. In 1911, a Bosch magneto was made available, replacing the separate battery box and the ignition coil needed to run the motor. In 1912, the motor design was changed from a vertical cylinder to a horizontal cylinder, along with the rudder steering. In 1913, a new 2-story factory was built with a capacity of 25 outboards a day, plus inboard motor production. In 1914, the size of the rudder was increased and the horsepower was raised to 3 horsepower. In 1915, a variable pitch propeller controlled from the tiller handle was introduced to allow more flexibility in speed and control. In the face of growing competition, Waterman sold the product name and manufacturing rights to his motors to Arrow Motor and Machine Company of Newark, New Jersey in 1917 for $20,000. Waterman's company then filed notice of its dissolution in March of 1918. The new owners produced the Waterman Porto and other motors for a short time, finally dropping them entirely in 1921. Okay, the 1909 Evinrude Motor Company. Ole Evinrude was born in Norway and emigrated to the US with his family in 1882. They settled on a farm in Ripley Lake near Cambridge, Wisconsin. From a very early age, Ole displayed an aptitude for all things mechanical. He left school after the 3rd grade and became an itinerant tradesman at the young age of 16, working in machine shops and factories in a number of different states, learning design, pattern making, and machining. Eventually, Ole settled in the Milwaukee area and set about courting a young lady by the name of Bess Carey, who would later become his wife. When Ole turned 23 in 1900, he was working for the E.P. Alice Company in Milwaukee as a pattern maker. In his spare time, he pursued his fascination with internal combustion engines and was determined to build his own horseless carriage. His first effort was literally a carriage with an engine. Ole persistently pursued the automobile business through two initial business partnerships, first with a fellow named Clark, and then as Clemick and Evinrude, realizing some success selling motors to various carriage builders and the US government who contracted 50 engines. However, the lack of business experience caused both partnerships to fail. In 1906, Ole formed a third partnership and started the Motor Car Power Equipment Company, yielding a second horseless carriage, but that partnership failed as well. Ole then returned to his own business of pattern making. His neighbor, young Bess Carey, provided much needed part-time help with the books and billing to help make sure the business was a success. As the story goes, it was on one of their dates that Ole got the idea for a detachable rowboat motor. Ole and Bess had rented a rowboat on a lake and rowed to an offshore island in the hot summer sun for a picnic, during which Bess said, "Wouldn't it be nice to have some ice cream in this hot weather?" Not wishing to disappoint, Ole rowed back to shore and purchased some ice cream at a lakeside shop. By the time he returned to Bess, however, the ice cream had completely melted. Melted mess gave Ole the idea for the need to speed up travel in a small boat using a portable motor for propulsion. Ole began tinkering around in his workshop and built a prototype outboard that he first tested in 1907. Ole and Russ Carey, his now brother-in-law, carried the creation to the Kinnickinnick River, rented a rowboat, clamped on the motor, and took off with a roar that brought dozens of people to the riverbank. At first critical of the effort and practicality of the project, Bess later encouraged Ole to clean up the design and offer it for sale. Ole refined the design and made enough parts for 25 motors. A friend's demonstration on Milwaukee Lake in 1909 netted 10 orders. The hand-built 1.5 horsepower motor weighed 62 pounds and sold for $62, about $1,800 in today's money. Bess wrote an advertisement which appeared in the Milwaukee papers. "Don't row, throw the oars away. Use an Evinrude motor." In the same year, Ole founded the Evinrude Motor Company in Milwaukee. In 1909, the firm began to sell its first commercial outboard motor. Nonetheless, the motor was an instant success due to its reliability, sleek design, and innovative features for its time. In September of 1910, Ole filed a patent application for a marine propulsion mechanism, which would be issued in 1911. Business boomed and the company needed to expand to a larger facility to accommodate the shop force, which now numbered 100 employees. Bess and her sister Dorothy were handling all the office work until Bess began a national advertising campaign. Within 3 days of the appearance of the first magazine ad, they had to hire 6 stenographers to handle all of the inquiries. Early in 1911, Chris Meyer, president of the Meyer Tugboat Lines, put up $5,000 for a 50% interest in the fledgling company. In 1911, production increased to more than 2,000 motors. The business was seasonal, however, so Bess contacted several exporters in New York to explore the sale of their outboard motors overseas. Their letter was eventually discovered by Olaf Mikkelsen, a Scandinavian clerk of an export company who convinced his boss that the motors had great potential in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. After an order of 2 motors to be used at a demonstration in Denmark, a firm order for 6 came, then 50 more. Mikkelsen and another man were sent to Milwaukee to call on B. Evinrude and negotiate a better price for a large order. The men were amazed to discover they were dealing with a young woman. Bess was more than a match for them, refusing to yield on the price, and she received an order for 1,000 motors. The problems stemming from the seasonal nature of the business were solved, and Mikkelsen became Evinrude's New York agent for international sales. By 1912, expansion of the business was again necessary. Ole was factory manager and chief engineer, while Bess handled advertising and public relations, as well as general supervision of the business. Sales in 1912 rose to more than 4,000 units and doubled that amount in 1913. The years of relentless work started to undermine the frail physique of Bess Evinrude. Ole had been working long hours for 4 years without a break or vacation. Ralph, their son, who had been born in 1907, was 6 years old, and they wanted to spend more time with him during his formative years. As a result, in 1913, with Bess's health failing, Ole sold his interest in the business to Chris Mower for $137,000, a large sum in those days. The transaction meant Ole could afford to take some time off. He bought a big Packard touring car, and the family embarked on a transcontinental journey. Years later, Ole designed a 42-foot cruiser, the Bess Emily, and toured the Great Lakes. In 1917, they headed down the Mississippi River to winter in New Orleans. With rest and relaxation, Bess's health was restored. Meanwhile, Chris Mower's Evinrude company continued the venerable robo-motor design, but added a 2-cylinder version and 4-cycle 2-cylinder motor, but all with limited success. Inboard motors based on the outboard powerhead were also added to the lineup. By this time, Ole had some fresh ideas and designed a new lightweight outboard motor. The processes and techniques of using aluminum had made great strides during World War I, and Ole recognized that its use in an outboard could result in a far lighter motor than the steel, iron, and bronze in the Evinrude outboards being manufactured at the time. However, Ole had signed a 5-year no-compete contract when he sold his interest to Chris Mower, which included the rights to the Evinrude name for outboard motors. Ole, out of loyalty, took the plans for his new motor to Mower. The new engine had many of the original rowboat motor features like battery ignition and flywheel knob starting, but had major improvements with 2 cylinders and improved powerhead with 3 horsepower and mostly aluminum construction, giving a weight of 48 pounds compared to the 72-pound Evinrude. However, Mower was successful with what he had and turned down the offer of a new partnership. Therefore, in the fall of 1920, Ole started a new outboard company called the Alto Outboard Motor Company. Because they had sold the rights to the Evinrude name, they needed a new name for the motor and the company. Bess suggested Alto, which stood for Evinrude Light Twin Outboard, a simple, catchy name that was easy to remember. The Alto Outboard Motor Company was formed in 1920 and production began in 1921. Because there was more competition in the outboard marketplace, the new Alto Motor Company suffered a loss of $10,000 for the first year, where 1,000 motors were sold, but grew steadily with 2,500 sold in 1922. The new Alto motor outstripped sales of Evinrude's original outboard motor within 3 short years. In the interim, other new outboard companies had joined the industry, including Lockwood Ash, Coban, Kale, and a few others. In 1923, a newly designed 2-cylinder, 2.5 horsepower Evinrude Sport Twin model debuted with more modern engineering that was competitive with other models from Johnson and Lockwood companies. However, with declining sales, Mower then sold the Evinrude company to an investment group with Walter Zinn as its president in 1922. 1925, Zinn sold Evinrude to August Petrie, owner of the Milwaukee Stamping Company, who then sold it in 1926 to Stephen Briggs, with Evinrude now become a subsidiary of the gasoline engine manufacturer Briggs & Stratton Corporation. Under Briggs, Evinrude responded with newly designed motors with an 8 horsepower model in 1927 and offered 6, 8, 12, and 16 horsepower models by 1928. Alto continued the growth with upgrades to its service twin, including improved cooling with a new design called Propello Pump. This design eliminated the limitations of a mechanical water pump by using the thrust from the propeller to force cooling water up through passages in the lower unit to the powerhead. In 1926, the original Alto twin was upgraded to 4 horsepower to keep pace with the competition. In 1928, the original 4 horsepower service twin was replaced as Alto had a more innovative approach with a 7 horsepower Alto Speedster twin and four-cylinder Elto quad rated at 18 horsepower. The quad was the first four-cylinder outboard and the first of the long line of four-cylinder engines. Meanwhile, Stephen Briggs looked for further opportunities to consolidate and grow his outboard motor business. Elto could be a great addition with Ole Evinrude, and Lockwood Outboards of Jackson, Michigan, with its brilliant chief engineer Finn Ergens, could round out a lineup of motors with offerings from all three companies. A merger was finalized on February 23, 1929, and Evinrude, Elto, and Lockwood combined with a total net worth of $4 million as the new Outboard Motors Corporation. The management consisted of Ole Evinrude as president, Stephen Briggs, chairman of the board, and Finn Ergens came over from Lockwood as chief engineer. Outboard Motors Corporation scarcely had time to get started before the stock market crash of October 1929. Already responsible for $500,000 in bank loans as a result of the merger, the company had to increase its debt to $600,000 between 1930 and 32. To keep the business afloat, the entire outboard inventory was sold at bargain prices, even though Ole Evinrude sacrificed his salary until his death in 1934. In 1930, further cost reduction steps were taken and the Lockwood line of motors was discontinued. During the Depression, new outboard designs were developed, including electric starting in 1930 on larger motors and a small lightweight motor of 2 3/4 horsepower called Fold Light, which could fold in half for compact carrying. Motors were now supplied to secondary markets as private label motors, such as Sea King for Montgomery Ward stores. 1930 brought new Elto designs with their lightweight twin 4 horsepower models, new speedster models of 8, 12, and 14 horsepower, and 3 new quads of 18, 35, and 50 horsepower. Motor refinements continued as the basic motors included rewind starters, simplified controls, and in 1934, hooded power motors, where the powerhead was now enclosed with metal covers for quieter operation and a more modern streamlined look. Four-cylinder motors were now offered in the smaller horsepower ranges, down to 5.5 horsepower for smoother, quieter running, and advances in engine design provided more dependable performance with lighter motor weight. Sadly, in 1933, brought the unexpected passing of Bess Evinrude at the age of 48. Bess had been an instrumental part and partner with Ole Evinrude in the founding and growth of both Evinrude and Elto outboard motor companies. Bess was a pioneer in her day, as women seldom enjoyed the chance she had in running a business, including sales, marketing, and day-to-day operations. Bess was instrumental in using women in her advertisements to promote ease of use in this new exciting sport. 1934 also brought the death of Ole Evinrude, as he was crushed with grief and loneliness over his wife and longtime business partner. Ole was 57 years old. Ole's son Ralph took over as president of the company, as he had grown up in and knew all aspects of the outboard business. 1935 brought the merger with Johnson Outboard Motor Company, which I'll cover separately. The last half of the 30s continued the refinement of all outboards to become more dependable, lighter in weight, with higher performance and reduced cost. Tiny motors, 1/2 horsepower up to 50 horsepower, 4-cylinder motors encompassed the range of offerings, with many technological developments as the motor designs continued to grow and mature. 1940 and the beginning of World War II brought a halt to all commercial outboard motor production in order to shift materials and production capacity to support the war effort. It should be noted that while Evinrude did not invent the outboard motor, his design was superior to those of his predecessors and made Evinrude's outboard motor commercially successful. Indeed, it can be said that Evinrude established the outboard motor industry, much like Henry Ford had done with his Model T Ford. The 1912 Kale Perfection Motor Company. Kale had its inception in 1893 when Arthur Kale founded the Kale Company and began operations in Saginaw, Michigan. The Kale Company was incorporated in 1901 when Arthur partnered with his older brother Adolph, and they relocated to Detroit, Michigan, laying the foundation for the Kale Brothers Manufacturing Company. Kale soon became one of the most successful companies in the coin-operated machine industry during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Their product line started with slot machines, but soon included arcade games, weight scales, strength testers, and gum machines. In 1901, the Kahle Perfection Motor Company was formed for the design and manufacture of stationary and inboard marine engines. The business grew, and by 1904, they had become the largest employer in Detroit, Michigan. Around 1906, the first outboard motor using gasoline was designed by a Yale law student from Detroit named Cameron Waterman. Waterman asked the Kahle brothers to build the first 25 outboard motors since they already had experience building gasoline engines of their own. When the Waterman motor sold out immediately, Kahle took note and began producing their own successful line of outboard motors beginning in 1912. The new Kahle portable boat motor was a 2-horsepower, single-cylinder, 2-cycle design, which sold for $70. In 1914, they added options including underwater exhaust and an externally mounted magneto replacing the standard battery box and spark coil. A folding rudder feature was also added to their motor. A patent for this feature was applied for in 1913 and granted in 1914. Also introduced was a less expensive base entry model called the Neptune, which sold for just $50. In 1915, Kahle introduced a 5-speed feature to allow their motor, which featured a tiller-operated variable pitch propeller, allowing a neutral position, trolling speed, high speed, and 2 reverse speeds. The motor could now also be had with an enclosed flywheel magneto. In 1916, brought the addition of the first recoil starter mounted on an outboard motor as an improvement over the spinning starter knob mounted on the flywheel. Kahle also produced their rowboat motors for private labeling by other companies. Model names include Sweet, American, Columbian, Emmons, and Glideway, to name a few. In 1918, Kahle produced a line of Liberty Drive motors, which replaced the standard right-angle lower unit with a long straight shaft connecting the powerhead crankshaft to the propeller. This model was designed by Kahle's General Superintendent, Antoine Liberty, and was intended for use in shallow and weedy water so the propeller could ride up over obstacles in the water. The single-cylinder 2-horsepower motor was popular with hunters and fishermen and was continually improved over its life until its last year of production in 1931. 1925 brought out 2 new motors. The first is the Kahle Pennant Twin. This motor was a newly designed 2-cylinder motor delivering 2 3/4 horsepower, with the design in keeping with competitors, including Johnson and Evinrude. The motor also incorporated the 5-speed feature, giving increased flexibility in operator control. The second is the Kahle Liberty Twin. This motor utilized the new Pennant powerhead, but installed on the Liberty Drive lower unit for an increase in power and versatility. 1926 introduced the Master 5-speed twin with an increase to 4 horsepower. 1928 brought new, more powerful models, including starting with the Model 30 and Model 30 Racer with 10 horsepower with tractor lower unit for racing applications. Like the other outboard manufacturers, Kahle's sales took a nosedive with the onset of the Depression. Production was reduced and the smaller models were promoted to encourage sales. 1929 to 31 continued the growth and refinement of the smaller models and the increase of horsepower in the standard and racing models to keep up with the competition in the important horsepower race of the time. New features like electric starting were also introduced for those wanting a larger motor with the starting convenience. Due to the effects of the Depression, Kahle was sold off in 1933 to a holding company, Fuller and Johnson, and finally went out of business in 1935. This slide we're looking at now is of the 1928 Kale Model 30 racer. I talked about a tractor lower unit. If you look at the lower unit, the propeller is on the leading edge, not the trailing edge of the gear case, which was thought to be an advantage at that time, and Kale was the first to pioneer that design. This is the museum's 1931 Kale Model 35 dual carburetor racer. This too also utilized the Kale tractor lower unit design. Okay, in 1914, the Lockwood Ash Motor Company was established. In 1901, the Lockwood brothers, Fred and Arthur, began a repair shop business in Jackson, Michigan, fixing everything from bicycles to electric motors. In 1903, the business was expanded with a sales agency for Pope Waverly and Oldsmobile automobiles. 1904, the brothers took on a partner named W.L. Ash, and the company was now named the Lockwood Ash Company. The company developed a line of inboard marine engines ranging from a single and twin cylinder engine all the way up to a 4-cylinder engine for boats from 12 to 40 feet in length. Motors were produced under the Lockwood Ash name, as well as the name Motorgo for Sears and Roebuck Company. (1914) was the year Lockwood Ash introduced their first outboard motor. The motor was based on current motor designs and had rudder steering, battery ignition, and was rated at 2 horsepower. Later, an externally mounted magneto could be had as an upgrade. 1915 brought a new flywheel magneto option for easier starting and more consistent performance, along with an improved exhaust muffler. These motors remained unchanged up until 1922, when an aluminum crankcase was cast together with the gas tank to make a simpler and lighter weight unit. Other improvements allowed the motor to run more smoothly and at a higher RPM. The venerable starter knob was replaced with a safety starter, so the starting rope could be used in its place. 1923 brought the elimination of rudder steering and a new propeller with a safety slip clutch to protect the motor if underwater obstructions were encountered. 1924 brought the introduction of the LA twin motor. This motor was an entirely new 2-cylinder design rated at 3 horsepower with an aluminum rudder for steering. Lockwood now had a competitive design similar to offerings from the other major manufacturers. 1926 introduced the Model 62T, now with propeller steering and lighter weight due to the increased use of aluminum. 1927 brought the name change to Lockwood Motor Company after W.L. Lockwood died in 1921, and A.L. Lockwood bought the remaining interest from the Ash family. 1928 brought the introduction of 2 brand new motors, the Lockwood Ace rated at 7 horsepower and the Lockwood Chief rated at 11 horsepower. Lockwood was now competitive with Evernude, Elto, and Johnson, and these successful motors set new records in outboard racing. (1929) brought the introduction of underwater exhaust for quieter operation and a special Lockwood Racing Chief with dual carburetors and higher RPM for racing applications. 1929 was also the year that Lockwood merged with Evernude and Elto to become the conglomerate Outboard Motors Corporation. 1930 brought an electric starting option for the popular Chief model, but this was the last year of production as cost-cutting measures dictated by the Depression gave OMC no choice but to discontinue the product line. Okay, we move on to 1922 and the Johnson Motor Company. The history of the Johnson Motor Company starts in Terre Haute, Indiana, with the 4 Johnson brothers, Louis, Harry, Julius, and Clarence. Their father, Soren, had immigrated from Denmark and became a tool dresser and machinist for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company at Effingham, Illinois. In 1903, the 2 older brothers were fascinated with engines and decided to make their own inboard marine engine to be used on the nearby Wabash River. The engine was a large 3-horsepower 2-cycle engine weighing 150 pounds. This was installed in their 18-foot rowboat and successfully pushed the boat along. Wanting more power, they built a larger single-cylinder engine of 12 horsepower and installed it in a new boat with great success. In 1905, the brothers set up shop in the barn behind the family home and offered for sale a 3-horsepower single-cylinder engine weighing only 65 pounds. Soon after, they offered 2- and 4-cylinder engines of similar design for sale. Their engine business was off and running. The Johnson Brothers Company grew and was moved to a larger location in Terre Haute. In 1908, Lou and Harry designed a new lightweight V configuration series of motors for use in marine and aircraft applications. The first was a 4-cylinder design, but soon 4, 6, 8, and 12-cylinder engines were made available. To demonstrate and publicize their new motors, they built a monoplane of their own design and tested their new motors. Later, a revised aircraft was built with good success and was flown around the circuits of the day to demonstrate the engines and earn money at the same time. As a side note, most aircraft designed at that time had 2 wings, were biplanes, and Johnson's were one of the first ones in this country to develop the monoplane. In 1912, Evertimers were made for marine engines and 4-cylinder from 4-cylinder to 12 cylinders in size and 60 to 120 horsepower. A 23-foot single-step race boat was constructed with 2 180-horse V12 engines. Records were set and many races in the area were won. 1913 brought disaster as a tornado and flood destroyed the Johnson factory and all was lost, including aircraft, boats, engines, and machinery used to make them. The brothers moved on to other interests for the time, including farming and other small industries. In 1915, Clarence designed a small, lightweight 2-cylinder Poe's twin engine. The original thought was to have the engine drive an air propeller and push a small boat through the water. Testing quickly gave disappointing results. The rig was then mounted on a bicycle, but the safety issues were just too great. Then Lou and Harry worked together with Clarence and devised a way to mount the engine over a bicycle back wheel and drive the wheel with a chain. Further refinements and an association with the Quick Action Ignition Company prompted a move to South Bend, Indiana, and the formation of the Johnson Motor Wheel Company. 1918 saw the start of production, and 17,000 units were produced by 1920. By 1920-21, Henry Ford, with his highly successful Model T, priced at just $370, devastated the sales of all 2-wheel vehicles, motorcycles, etc., and sales plummeted. Now something else had to be found to replace the motor wheel business. Lou used the 2-cylinder powerhead and came up with a lightweight new outboard motor. In 1921, the new Johnson Motor Company was incorporated to make outboard motors. Johnson designed their own carburetors, refined the ignition system for higher RPM operation, and introduced the Model A motor in 1922. The new motor was in to mostly aluminum construction and a 2-horsepower rating. A single-cylinder Model J was introduced in 1925, rated at 1.5 horsepower. 1926 brought out a new 6-horsepower engine that was bigger than anything the competition had to offer. Johnson was the first outboard motor to plane a boat with a speed of 16+ miles per hour and dominated outboard racing right away. Neither the Evinrude Company nor Elto could match this. Now far ahead, Johnson produced a net profit of $433,000 in 1927, far outpacing Evinrude's $25,000 and Elto's $30,000. Increased manufacturing capacity was now needed to keep up with the demand, and a new factory was established in nearby Waukegan, Illinois. 1927 brought out larger motors with 8 horsepower and new advancements in the cooling system, replacing the old style water pump with a new pumpless pressure vacuum system. 1928 brought out an increase in horsepower to 13 with the model P40 and PR40 racing motor. This was Johnson's first factory-built racing outboard. The big news was a huge two-cylinder model TR40 motor rated at a whopping 25 horsepower. 1929 continued the horsepower race with additional new service and racing models. A new four-cylinder model V45 now provided 26 horsepower for larger boating applications, and a VR45 for racing applications was rated at 32 horsepower. A new induction system now used a cylindrical rotary valve mounted between the carburetor and the crankshaft and was gear driven off the crankshaft to control the incoming mixture rather than the old three-port cylinder design. A compression release allowed easier starting of the larger, higher compression motors. 1930 was notable with the introduction of smaller, lighter, more efficient alternate firing motors, easily supplying the same or more horsepower than the older opposed cylinder type motors. Electric starting was now offered on the larger models for easier use in large boat applications. The Depression was now hitting hard all the outboard manufacturers, but especially Johnson. With its huge success with a major portion of the market, Johnson had made aggressive plans for the future. However, a too costly advertising campaign, as well as an ill-timed offering of matched motors and hulls, drained all cash reserves by 1930. When control of the company passed to its bankers, when control of its company passed to its bankers. Next came an attempt to lessen its reliance on seasonal sales by entry into the refrigerator compressor market. This last-ditch effort did not revive the business, and shortly thereafter, Johnson was for sale. In 1932, the Johnson Motor Company was placed into receivership and was under the control of investment firm Hayden Stone and Company. In 1935, they decided to sell Johnson to the highest bidder, and Stephen Briggs was determined to add additional muscle to Outboard Motors Corporation by purchasing Johnson. Briggs and Ralph Evinrude purchased Johnson for $800,000, and Briggs became president in order to manage that division back to profitability. The formation of OMC was then complete. Now, as part of OMC, the last half of the 30s continued the refinement of all outboards to become more dependable, lighter in weight with higher performance and reduced cost. The alternate firing motor design was expanded to all motors of 10 horsepower or less. Larger outboards were further refined for large boat applications. Rewind starters and enclosed power heads resulted in quieter operation. 1940 and the beginning of World War II brought a halt to all commercial outboard motor production in order to shift materials and production capacity to support the war effort. Okay, the Kiefer Corporation of 1939. Born in 1906, in Mequon, Wisconsin, E. Carl Kiefer was always attracted to machines and had a drive to understand how things worked. After leaving his family's farm to pursue a career in electrical engineering and manufacturing, he attended the Milwaukee School of Engineering and later the University of Wisconsin. Despite not receiving a formal degree until later in life, Carl became an electrical engineer. He began his career as a draftsman at Nash Motors in Milwaukee. However, he soon became discontented drawing the blueprints, and his natural curiosity to understand machines led to his termination. His next stop in 1927 was Evinrude Motors, also in Milwaukee, where he lasted just 3 months. He then landed a position at Stern Magnetic, where he remained for 11 years before founding the company that would become Mercury Marine. In 1939, Carl founded the bankrupt Thor Outboard Motor Company, named after founder Thorvald Hansen. Thor made a line of outboard motors sold under the Thor brand name, but also a single-cylinder outboard engine under the Sea King name for retailer Montgomery Ward. Quality was poor, and the motors were rejected by Montgomery Ward. On February 8, 1939, 2 weeks after assuming control of the bankrupt manufacturing plant, the non-functioning outboards were redesigned to include an adjustable carburetor, improved ignition system, and a balanced crankshaft. The improved Sea King motors were sold back to Montgomery Ward, who had provided capital to fund the modest changes to the engines. The Outboards were then introduced to the boating public at the 1939 Milwaukee Sportsman Show. Built in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, the improved Thor engines were enough to spark additional orders from Montgomery Ward, as well as the national chain of Western auto stores, which sold under the brand name Wizard. This provided Keycaver's entry into the outboard motor business. Keycaver then streamlined the gas tanks and lower units to create the slimmest, most compact outboard available. Other enhancements were more than just cosmetic. Performance improving developments included reed valves for reducing backfires, the Keycaver designed twin flux magneto, and the Rotex positive water pump, which doubled engine cooling capacity. In 1940, utilizing resources from the development of private label outboards, Keycaver Corporation introduced Mercury outboards at the New York Motorboat Show in January of 1940. The 5 models, 3 single-cylinder and 2 twins, were simply named models K1 through K5. Entry into World War II stopped all commercial outboard production, but the Keycaver Corporation manufactured small drone motors for target aircraft and developed 2-man chainsaws for the US military during the war. Okay, we'll next take a look at just a smattering of pictures kind of depicting outboard racing and how it developed. Here's a view.
For that, you'll have to turn off airplane mode.
Was my cell phone. Outboard racing started with Evinrude's detachable rowboat motor. Here's a shot of one of the first races. The Evinrude company sponsored some of the races, and here's one of the trophies that they gave out. This picture in 1911 is thought to be the first sanctioned outboard race in America, held at Lake Pewaukee, Wisconsin, sponsored by the Pewaukee Yacht Club. The first outboard to push a boat over its planing wake is a known event. In 1921, Clay Conover was test running a new Johnson motor for his father on a small boat. The officially recorded, recognized time measured course events start here. You can see from the about a 15-year period from 1924 up to 1939, recognized top speeds and went from 11 miles an hour all the way up to 78 miles an hour. So this shows how the development in the outboard motor power heads, miniaturization of the components, introduction of aluminum and new technologies in 2-cycle engine design make great advances in power enabling these speeds. This is about a 1928 Evinrude Speedy Twin on a typical stepped hull racing boat. If you're going to the races, this is how you hauled your boats, with a homemade trailer using a Model T Ford front axle and towed behind your touring car. Here's a shot from 1935 on the Hudson River in New York State. Here's a model KR Johnson from the early 30s. Here's a shot at the dock around 1930, probably at the beginning of the Albany to New York City marathon race. Here's a 1928 Alto Ace at speed. Notice on top of the flywheel, there's the cable mounted, which operated a cable-driven tachometer to gauge engine speeds. In 1930, Lockwood developed a very specialized series of racing engines called the Speedy Bee, and this is one of them in its original or first trials. Here's a 1929 Johnson model S45 on a typical racing hull in its day. Here's a shot at the dock in the early 30s with a wide variety of motors waiting for the races to start. This is a Pigeon race boat from 1928, powered by a 1928 Alto Quad. Another dock shot in the early 30s of boats and motors waiting for the races to start. Helen Henschel was a very popular and successful woman driver, and this is one of her boats in 1928 with an Evinrude Speedy Twin. Again, a shot of how people went to the races and hauled all their gear. Here's a 1928 Elto quad on a period race boat. 28 Elto Speedy Twin heading out for races. Here's another 28 Lockwood Ace. Again, here's how we hold our boats to the races. Here's another 1928 shot of a race in progress. You can see kind of a wide variety of different race boat hull styles, as well as different motors powering the boats. Here's a 1928 Evinrude Speedy Twin powering a baby whale boat that were produced in Massachusetts. The Flowers Boat Yard in Long Island in the 1930s made their own race boats. This trailer with two original boats was found in a barn on Long Island some years ago, and it still exists to this day. Another dockside view of early 30s race boats waiting to go. Here's an Elto 460 on the river, on Hudson River in the Albany to New York City race. A typical racing rig of the late 20s with an Evinrude. This one happens to be an Evinrude Fast Twin, which is about an 8 horsepower motor. Another typical race view from the late 20s. 1920 Evinrude Speedy Twin. This is a 1930 Johnson model SR45. This boat and a similar motor on display on the 3rd floor of the museum right now. Another dock view, probably 1930, getting ready for the Albany to New York City marathon race. This is a 1929 Johnson model VR45. And that's it for race boat pictures, and kind of the end of the presentation. I just wanted to give a mention to the Antique Outboard Motor Club. Some of the members of the club and myself were helped out put the display together for the museum. If you have an interest in antique outboard motors, I highly recommend you take a look at the club. Go to the website. There's a quarterly publication, their Facebook pages. Lots of people interested in old motors and are willing to help. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and perhaps some questions.
Thank you, Gary. So I'd just like to open the floor, so to speak, to questions. If anybody would like to take advantage of the chat box at the bottom of your screen to post your question, or simply unmute yourself and ask a question or share a comment or thought, we welcome it. Let me just check the chat room now, make sure there's nothing already sitting there. All right, here's a question. What is the oldest motor in your collection?
In my collection is a 1911 Waterman.
1911 Waterman, okay. Let's see, whoops. Next out, let me go on. Gary, how important were the racing engines to the development of the outboards?
Really important in two ways. One was a way for the factories to try out new technologies as the new designs were developed. And also the races provided great media and interest for the public, so that when the old saying, "You race on Sunday and sell on Monday," goes for the outboard industry as well. People would go to the races, which was a big deal back in the time. They would see Evinrude's and Lockwoods and Johnson's run and say, "Oh boy, those are really fast motors. Maybe that's what I should have for my boat." And they would then go to their local dealer, and sales would happen as a result.
Interesting. All right. Anyone else, please feel free to just unmute and ask a question or put it right in the chat here. Okay, please talk a little about the fact that women were also competitors.
Gary, any idea of what's going to happen with that Evinrude?
Which Evinrude now?
The present day Evinrude.
Oh, they're pretty much out of business. They were sold off to Bombardier, and Bombardier has stopped Evinrude production right now. So really it's down to Mercury Marine is really the only American brand that still survives.
Ah,
I'm sorry, Allison, what was the other question?
This is a question. Please talk a little about the fact that women were also competitors.
Yeah, women, of course, were interested in sporting events. And this was a sport they could pretty easily compete in, of course, with some help. But women being smaller and lighter and having quicker reflexes fit right in and make great drivers of the racing boats and hydroplanes of the time. So they developed a niche, and there were a number of women who were very, very successful and won many trophies and championships as a result.
I'd like to just mention too, we have a section of the our exhibit that's up until October on women racers and hydroplane racing, specifically from 1900 to 1940.
Right.
Here's another question. Whatever happened to the champion outboards?
Champions existed into the early 40s. You got me there in my history. They were absorbed by another company, but the name fails me right off.
amazing how many motor companies there have been over the years.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Champions also got into racing in their later years, in the late 40s and early 50s. They made a racing motor specifically designed for that, but it eventually was outclassed by other motors of the time.
During World War II, did Evinrude make 4-cylinder 50-horse motors for the military?
Yes, they did, called Stormboat motors. Yeah, they took their big 4-cylinder 50-horse engine that was commercially produced up until wartime and kind of reinvented it, and it became basically a barge motor for the military to use. Absolutely. It made it a bigger, heavier motor with a longer, lower unit, all heavy duty construction. And yeah, they were used extensively in Europe during the war effort.
You ever see any of those around now?
Yeah, there's a few around. Johnson also made a similar model, but it was the 2-cylinder design, and there's quite a few of those around as well. Many of them existed as war surplus, so they're around.
Huge things.
They are.
Anyone else, any questions? Comments? Anything? Well, I personally want to thank you so much then for this really interesting and informative talk. Again, I encourage anyone who hasn't already to visit our incredible exhibit on the 3rd floor of our museum through October. And you can actually see some of Gary's collection and amazing engines that are on display at the museum as well. But if no one has any more questions, then I'm going to wish everyone a safe evening. And thank you all so much for coming and for your support of the museum. And thank you so much, Gary.
Okay,
for putting on this amazing discussion. I really appreciate it. And I know this recording will be made available to the public. Probably usually takes a few weeks, but it will be on the museum's Facebook channel and other social media channels. So if you know anyone who would hope to see it and wasn't able to, it will be accessible there. But I thank you all very much for coming, and thank you so much again, Gary. We really appreciate it.
okay, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Night.
Thank you, Gary.
Yep,
Care.
take
Bye-bye.
care now.